So we've all seen one of these cookie consent banners. The internet is now full of them, and as you can see, this one's quite an intrusive one. It's taken up almost a third of the screen, and I actually can't click anywhere until I literally have to go and accept it. And that's typically the first thing that you do, is when one of these things pops up, you just blindly go and, yeah, give me whatever it is you want to give me. I don't care, just get it out of the way as quickly as I can, because I'm not interested. I just want to get on with my life and get stuff done. What if we could do this a slightly different way? What if we could come over here, and when we show our dialogue that we have to do, we can just click off that, and look, without any clicking on the consent dialogue, we've got an auto-dismissing acceptance of the cookie consent. This is a much better experience, and I think this is how the internet should have worked in GDPR terms. I think the whole government legislation around GDPR is a mess, and I think they've ruined the internet as a result. It should have been an experience like this that's more seamless for the end user. So let's go and take a look at how we can make this happen. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, whenever it is that I find you, and welcome along to the channel. So today we're talking about GDPR and cookie consent. So let's crack on and get into it. So we're going to use this Nuxt cookie control as our component that's going to control our cookie consent. So the first thing that we need to do is install said component. So we're going to do an npm install Nuxt cookie control, and that will add that to our project. And while that's loading, we're going to need to come over to the Nuxt config, and in the modules section, so at the bottom here, we need to add this particular piece here. So we're adding in the Nuxt cookie control into our Nuxt config. The control button means that you get to see a little button that will bring up the cookie consent dialog essentially, and the bar position is basically where the dialog appears by default. So it's just a couple of settings there that we need to position. And then with that, we actually need to go and configure some stuff on the actual plugin itself. So underneath, or anywhere in the Nuxt config, where should we put it? Under the Google Tag Manager. There we go. Let's put it in there. We can add in a section that details the settings for the actual cookie consent itself. So here we detail what the cookie options are that we want inside that cookie consent banner, and some text that we want shown. So we're just picking the defaults at the moment just to get this up and running. That's now installed, so let's come over here, and that's now rebuilding. So the last piece just to get this up and on the page is to come over to our layout that we use for all of our pages, and in here we need to add in the actual component itself. So we can just put in cookie control at the bottom of the layout there, and that adds it to the HTML. And we can see as soon as we've done that, we've got this pop-up come up over here. Let's just blow this up so that we can see what we're doing. So let's go and clear out all of our cookies out of the site, and get rid of our developer tools, and let's refresh the page. And because now this thinks this is the first time we've visited this site, we get our cookie consent banner come up, which is a good start. But obviously if we navigate around, we've still got that cookie consent banner. So it's basically the defaults, and we can choose to accept everything there. And if we go into manage cookies, we can see that that's the default that we configured inside our Nuxt Nuxt config rather. So these are the cookies that it thinks it needs by default. So if we just accept, so these are the necessary cookies essentially. So if we accept all of those, then we can see that we get our little cookie consent banner down here, which we can bring up with that button. So this is the kind of default behavior of this component. So let's move on and let's have a look at how we can customize some of this stuff. So we know that when we call our API, we've got an auth cookie that we need to use that holds our authentication to the API. So how can we show that to the end user that that's what we need to do? So let's come over to the cookies here, and as well as those cookies, we can say that the auth cookie is a mandatory cookie, and we can come back over, so I can save that while we're there, come back over to the layout, and we can customize what we see in the cookie control itself. So let's just make this a proper component tag, and let's paste in some HTML. So essentially what this is saying is it's going to iterate over the cookies that we've defined inside of our Nuxt config, and it's going to basically display them in a slightly different manner. So when I come over here now, we get our cookies used that we can see here, and then the actual cookie itself with a nice comma and not after the last one. So it's basically just showing a much nicer dialog. So that's tidied up our dialog and how it looks a little bit. So we've got control over that. So the next thing we need to look at is the additional cookies that we might use. So these are ones that an end user will have to opt in to actually use. They're not essential to the site. So things like our Google Tag Manager and Google Analytics and all of that sort of good stuff that we need for our site, but obviously the end user has to opt in to whether or not they want to use those. So we've got this necessary section here. So underneath that, we can add in an optional section, and inside that optional section, we can create an object. And the object has a name which represents the optional element that we want to represent. So this is for our Google Tag Manager cookies that we use. The identifier is the actual underlying cookie that will be used, and the description that we give it is what appears inside the dialog. We can give it an initial state, so we want to set that to true. So that's whether it's checked in the cookie consent banner by default or not. Then we give it a list of the cookies just for the information for the end user that actually gets set. So for Google Analytics and Google Tag Manager, it sets these particular cookies. If you go and look in the developer tools, you'll see these, and the container ID is obviously variable depending on your Google settings. So this contains your personal container ID. And then we've got a couple of placeholder, for now, methods for what happens when the user accepts or declines. So when they toggle that checkbox to say whether or not they're buying into allowing you to use these particular cookies or not. So we've got some callback methods that we can hook into there to do some stuff when they opt in or opt out. With that all running, if I come over and come back and try and reset ourselves to our initial state, let's get rid of our cookies and refresh the site so that we get our default state. And if I go into the manage cookies dialog, you can see now that as well as our default cookies, we get optional cookies. It's selected by default. It gives us our nice description, and it shows the cookies that are going to be set if you opt into this particular option. So we can accept all of those again for now. So we've got some customization that we can do in terms of that particular dialog. So let's try and make it fit a little bit better with the color scheme that we've got in our site. So in the Nuxt cookie control section up in the modules, in here we've got the option to override some default settings, so we can change some colors, and this is all detailed on the website for the Nuxt cookie control about how you can go and do this and what settings are available for you to override. So we're going to change the active background to green, which doesn't really fit with our website, but we'll change that again in a minute. And the inactive background to dark grey. So let's just let that recompile and go and show that that actually does actually work. And as well as using this is just CSS in here, so as well as using actual colors, you could use some variable or other, so you could change that if you've got something in your global CSS to var some variable or something like that, and it will pick that up. So just so that you're aware of that. So let's bring that up, and we can see that we've got our green checkbox here, or selector, and if we deselect it we get a nice dark grey, which is a slightly different one to this grey up here, just to indicate that this one you can't select, so it's greyed out essentially, whereas this one is selectable, so it's a slightly darker grey to show that it's not been selected, and then it obviously turns green. So we'll make that blue so that that fits in a bit better with the rest of the colour scheme of our site. So that shows how we can customize some of the elements and some of the CSS we can override in this particular dialog box. But let's come down and have a look at what goes on and when these methods are actually called down here. So for now, let's just put an alert in there for that to show when that fires, and an alert in here for this to show when this fires, and save that, let that rebuild. And if we uncheck that, when we hit the save button here, we get our cookie declined, so that's when it actually calls that script. And then likewise, if we go in and we actually select that and save it, again we get the cookie accepted. So it's basically off the back of that save method that these get called. And also if we are refreshing the page, so we've already set our cookie consent previously because we visited this site before, you still get that accepted or declined call being made. So if that's my preference and I've saved that, and I come in and I refresh the site, I still get that method called. So it means that we can use these to set up the state of the site consistently across visits to our website, which is a good thing. So let's just show a slight niggly issue here. So if I stop the site and start our staging site, and remember our staging version of our site is actually hooked up to Google Tag Manager. So just while that's rebuilding, let's again come over here, reset our site to its initial state. So get rid of any cookie settings. It's gone to cookie consent declined, which is fine. But you can see here that before I've even accepted any cookies, straight away we've got our optional cookies. Even though I haven't accepted anything yet, we've got our Google Tag Manager cookies already being set up and being used. So this would be in contravention of the whole cookie consent legalities, and you'd probably get into some trouble for this. So we need to fix that because that's a bad state to be in. So how do we fix that? Let's jump back over here and let's go to the auto init flag of the Google Tag Manager. So at the moment, Google Tag Manager is always initializing itself and saying that it can be used. So we need to turn that off so that it waits for the cookie consent before the initialization gets done on the Google Tag Manager. So that's the first key thing. And then down in the accepted function, so in here, we need to actually initialize the Google Tag Manager. So we can get rid of that alert for now and replace it with this. So what this is doing is this is actually, so the $Nuxt is actually stored against the window object on the client side. So we can use that in here to get hold of the Nuxt context, essentially, is what this is. And given that we've got the Nuxt context, we can then get hold of the $GTM like we would do anywhere else inside of our Nuxt application. And we can call the init function, which is essentially what that auto init was doing. And we supply in our Google Tag Manager key that we've got from our environment above. So if you remember, for those of you that have been following along, And for those of you that haven't, shame on you, but you can go back and have a look at how we've enabled some of this. So we've got right up the top here somewhere our public runtime config. We've got our Google Tag Manager key that comes from our global settings. That's where that is all coming from. So let's just jump back down to where we were, and that's basically what we're supplying in here is our unique Tag Manager key, and we're initializing Google Tag Manager at that point, but only now when the accepted function is called, so i.e. when they opt in to using those optional cookies, which is exactly what we want it to happen. So let's save that and rerun this up and get rid of all of our cookies again. So that's built, and we can see that we now get no cookies, and we can navigate around our site and we still get no cookies until we accept or go and check that checkbox on, and then it will call our accepted, and then we're allowed to use our Google Tag Manager cookies and we get our cookie consent set up. So, but just incidentally, if I go and disable that and then save, we see that we get our cookie consent declined, which removes one of our cookies but leaves one of our other cookies still hanging around. So we've still got our cookie consent, which tells us that we've consented to cookies in some shape or form, but the fact that we've declined the optional cookies, and this is leaving the Google Tag Manager cookie in our browser, isn't a great state of affairs. And the reason that it's doing that is because it uses this list of cookies when you actually decline to remove those cookies. And because this one is not explicitly named because it's got that container ID in it, it can't actually remove it. So we need to go and do some extra work in the declined function to go and tidy this cookie up when they decline. So let's go and have a look at what we need to do here. So let's get rid of that and let's paste in some code. So we get hold of all the cookies, and for those of you that know how cookies work, they're stored against the document object just with a semicolon delimiter between them, so all of these come out as a single string. So what we're doing here is splitting these into these 3 different cookies that are registered in the browser at the moment. And then given that we've got essentially a collection, then we can iterate around that collection, and we have to do a bit of work. So we get hold of the current cookie and we just remove any leading spaces before the actual cookie name. So sometimes the browser can actually store some leading spaces, so that's all that's doing, is tidying that up so that what we're left with is actually the cookie name. And then given that we've got that cookie name in our C variable, we can check if C starts with _GA_, which is exactly what this cookie starts with. Then we can go and actually remove that from the cookies using the cookie manager itself. So again, we get hold of the Nuxt context, we get hold of the $cookies, which is the name that the cookie control consent variable registers itself as within Nuxt, and then we can use a method on that to go and remove that cookie. So let's just save that and rebuild. Again, let's go and reset our site back to its default state, refresh the site, we get our default cookie consent come up, we can accept all of our cookies, and we get our Google Tag Manager cookies come up. We can then come in and disable the optional cookies and save that, and it removes both those cookies now correctly as we would expect. So all we're left with are the cookies that we've actually consented that are necessary for use on the site. So this is good, this is starting to come together. But I don't like this particular button. It's obviously obscuring part of my website down here. It stands out. It doesn't really blend in very well with the site, although it's useful if you're not very good at coding or you don't want to do any of this kind of handcrafting yourself. Then it's good that you get these things out of the box. But I want to try and make this a little bit more integrated with the site. So how can I go and get rid of this? So let's go and have a look at doing just that. Back over in the Nuxt config again, inside the module section again, which is up here. So up in here, So I can set control button to false up here so that I don't get that by default. And then I can go and enhance some of this stuff to go and allow me to bring that up manually myself. So over in, I'll put something in the footer, HTML. Let's replace this div here. So I'm moving my company into a div with a class of links. So let's get rid of that. And then also inside that links div, I've got a link, a Nuxt link that says cookie preferences, and it's going to call a method that I'm going to go and add in a moment. So let's just jump down to the CSS and style up this links div section here. So let's do that so that we get some nice styling, and then let's go and add that show cookie prefs method. So up in the script, after the fetch, and that we can have a methods section, and we have that show cookie prefs method. And inside here we get hold of the Nuxt config, which is obviously this, and we do the $cookies, which gets hold of the Nuxt cookie consent, and we just say to enable the modal dialog. And that's all of this again is in the documentation for this component. So essentially on that button click, we enable the modal dialog. So we can come back over here and we can already see that I've got my cookie preferences link. And if I click on that, I then see the dialog. So that's good. So that's got that working. So now I don't have that horrible button hovering over. I've got a nice link in my footer to enable my cookie consent dialog. So you can style this and label this however you want. So alongside the actual modal dialog of managing your cookies, typically you have a cookie consent document that you can use to detail more about the whole cookie policy that you have on your website, why you use cookies, etc., rather than just allowing people to opt in or opt out. So how can we go and add one of those pages in? So at this point it should be fairly obvious to you. So it's just another page in our site. So we're going to come over to pages and we're going to create a new page called cookie policy, and inside cookie policy we'll do our usual view with our scoped styles, and inside our template we'll have a div with a Nuxt content like we've done elsewhere. So we're referencing the Nuxt content for this particular page, so it's going to go across to our content management system to actually get the detail. And then this is basically saying that you could put some tables in here or something, some more information that you couldn't really do in Markdown to represent what the cookies are and when they expire and that kind of thing. So you've got total control over how much information you actually supply to the end user. Let's specify our layout file so that we don't break all of our layout when we move and show this particular page. And then let's jump over to the content directory and create our cookie policy markdown file. So in here we'll create cookie policy markdown, and in that markdown file we'll have some front matter that details about this particular page of the site. Then we'll have a header to give the page title, and then just some boilerplate text about cookies, what they're used for, how they work, that kind of stuff. So typical thing that you can find in a cookie policy. And then we'll have another section that says that you can change these from the cookie preferences on our website. And then finally, so let's save that. We need to come back over to the footer, and in our template underneath our Nuxt link, we can add another Nuxt link in there to the cookie policy page itself. So let's save that, and let's get rid of the dev tools. We've got our cookie policy down here, and we click on that and we can come over and we can actually see our cookie policy. But from this page, what if we actually want some kind of link in here to actually do what this does here? So if I want to actually say If you want to change your cookie preferences, click here or something like that. So we need some way in our markdown to do exactly what this link is doing down here. So let's just go and have a little refactor on stuff and see how we can actually do this. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a component to do this. So let's create a brand new component called cookie preferences link. And again, let's set up our default view bits and pieces. And inside the template, all this is going to do is exactly what the other link was doing. So it's going to call a method called show cookie prefs, and it's also going to allow us to supply in from an external source some extra content that we want to actually be populated inside the content of that link. So that's the purpose of this slot here. So this is just view code using slots. So with that there, we can then add our method into our script. So that gives us our show cookie prefs, which again is doing nothing more than actually just getting the cookie consent modal and setting it to true to say that we actually want to show that. And we don't need any styling in here. So with that in place, that's all we need there. We can then come back over to our markdown file, and we can replace the cookie preferences piece of text here with that actual component. So we're calling our cookie prefs link and then giving it the text of cookie preferences. So this is the slot essentially that's going to get inserted into that component. So to all intents and purposes, to the end user, this looks exactly the same, but this is now an actual component, and when they click on this link, it's going to call that code that's in that component, the show cookie prefs method. So just to complete things as well, let's come back over to the footer and let's just tidy this up so that rather than needing to do a Nuxt link and do all of that work twice, what we can actually do is replace this link here and all of that with a call to that component instead. So we no longer need cookie preferences, and here we can pass in a different text as part of the slot, and then we can get rid of this method back down here again. We don't need that anymore. So that tidies that up so that that's both methods are using that new component that we've created. So let's just come over to our site and let's do a full-on refresh, and we can see that instantly changes to a link. So we've got cookie preferences here, and when I click on that, that shows the modal. And down here, I can also do cookie preferences, and that shows the modal. So they're both using that same component to do exactly the same thing, which is pretty sweet. But we're not done yet. So it's coming together slowly but surely. We've still got the situation where if this is the first time that you've visited the site, and you get that cookie consent banner, I can click around willy-nilly, happily, without accepting anything on here, or default accepting and dismissing this. So let's go and have a look at how we can do that auto acceptance of cookies. So as soon as you click on any link on the site or navigate around anywhere, we want to say that you are essentially, exactly as it says here, if you continue browsing, we consider that you have accepted the cookies. Yeah, and this is the important thing. So we are declaring that that's the behavior that we're going to give them. So let's go and actually make that happen. Back over to the code again, and let's just close out the cookie policy stuff because we don't need that anymore. What we need to do is we actually need somewhere in our application where we can globally hold the state as to whether they've consented or not to the cookies. At the moment, it's not very easy for us to interrogate the cookie consent banner in a global fashion anywhere across our site and understand whether or not this person has actually consented or not to the site. So we're going to do that using the Vuex store. So let's come over here and create a new part of the store called cookie consent. And inside there, we're going to have just a flag inside this part of the state, which just says whether or not you've consented to the cookie consent or not. So alongside that, we need our usual rest of our boilerplate to expose and manipulate this value. So let's create some getters. So we have a get cookie consent that basically returns the value of that flag. We also have some actions to set the consent and also sync the consent with the cookie consent control. So we'll get to kind of where this is called, but that's essentially what's happening here. Is it's allowing you to sync up this flag with the value of what the cookie consent control itself thinks the value should be. And given that we've got some actions there, we obviously need some mutations. I'm just going to paste in quite a lengthy mutation section, and then we'll talk back through it. So the mutation section has a sync consent, which is obviously what the sync consent is calling. It also has an update consent, which is what the update consent is calling. So sync consent is quite straightforward. It's just setting the flag to whatever is passed in. The update consent has to do a little bit more because it has to work out what's been consented to, basically. So all of this code is pretty much from the actual cookie consent control itself. But the reason that we need it in here is so that we can set the flag alongside that, which is what we're doing as the very first thing in here. So we're doing exactly what the cookie control itself does in the update consent. And we can just see some of that. Let's go over and look in the node modules, Nuxt cookie control, components, and the cookie control view. So this is the actual component code itself. So we can see in here there are some methods around when consent is actually accepted. So it's setting cookies here for the actual cookie control itself. And so back over in our code, we're doing exactly the same thing. We are setting that cookie consent in here and then doing exactly what it does over here. So if not reload, you can see if not reload, it's doing exactly the same code. So it's pretty much a cut and paste of that, other than the fact that we're updating our state alongside it. So let's save that. And if we come over here, we've got a fresh site without cookie consent. And let's just bring our DevTools across a little bit. And I've got the Vue DevTools installed here. So I can go and look at the various aspects of Vuex. And if I go and look at the cookie consent area, we can see that cookie consent is false. So if I go and accept all and navigate around, we can see that cookie consent is still false. So we're not updating our state in any way, shape or form. So that's the next part that we need to do. So let's come over to our layout and let's put in a reference to our cookie control on the page so that we can actually reference it in some script further down. So with that in place, I can then come down here, and Prettier will probably want to move this, but I can add in the mounted method, and inside mounted I can do a watch on, well, I can do a global watch, and what we're looking for is when the value of the consent changes inside the cookie control itself. So we're getting hold of the cookie control using the refs object, and once we've got hold of that, we can look inside it at the cookies and the consent value. So this is the value that the cookie control itself thinks it's got, and we can see some of this if we come over to the components. We can look inside the actual cookie control itself, and we can see that cookies is an object here. So this is essentially what we're doing, is we're getting hold of this control and then traversing through here. So we can see there is a value inside the cookies object called consent, and that is set to true at the moment because we've accepted it. So that's essentially what we're getting hold of here, and that's the value that we're watching. So when that value changes, we get our new value, and we call a method on the store which is going to go and update our cookie consent in our Vuex store value. So in the cookie consent area, we do a sync consent and we pass it the new value of the consent. With that done and in place, let's come over here and run that test again. So let's get rid of all of our cookies. Let's refresh from scratch. We've got no cookies, And if we look in Vue and we look at Vuex, we can see our consent is false, so that's consistent. And then when we accept, we can see that consent has now been set to true. So that's good. That's showing that our Vuex store is now in step with our cookie consent control. But interestingly, if I go and do a control F5 and refresh from the server, if I go and show the components, the cookie control says its consent is true, which is certainly what we're seeing in the UI. We're not seeing any opt-in dialog or anything like that. So it thinks we've already consented. And that certainly makes sense from what we're seeing from the cookies. But inside our Vuex store, because we've done a server refresh, we haven't actually synced that up from a server-side refresh. So that's the next problem. So let's go and sort that one out. So for this, we need a plugin. So let's go to our plugins and let's create a new plugin called Cookie Consent, and we do client just as a convention. And then inside here, this will basically get run when there is a server-side refresh. So we can use exactly the same thing. We can call cookie consent, and we can get the value of that consent flag out of the cookie control at this point, called sync consent on the Vuex store, to make that actually sync up. So that's the plugin done. Let's go and add it into our Nuxt config. So inside here, we need to actually go and add that in. Let's paste that in, save that, let that refresh up, and then do that test again. And let's do a refresh, and we should see that false is now a true. And I can refresh this as many times as I like. Every time I refresh that, the consent is now in step with the cookie consent. Excellent. So we can accept the dialog on the client, and we can also, if we've previously accepted it, do a server-side refresh and we're coming back in. We know our Vuex store is now all in sync with our cookie consent state. So that was a long way around to get to a point where we actually know whether or not we've consented. So in terms of auto consenting now, so making that happen automatically, we need to come over to our layout, and inside the $root method, here we go, in here, we need to go and set consent. So every time we navigate around our site, this root method gets called. So what we can do is say that if the store consent, if we haven't already consented, then go and say that we are consenting automatically. So let's just show that all working, clear everything out, refresh the site. We've got no cookies, and I'm on the contact page, and as soon as I navigate around, I get my cookies, and the consent dialog has disappeared. Vue's happy that we've consented, so it's all looking good. So that's how we can auto dismiss the cookie consent, which is so much better for the user. It's a much nicer experience to have a site that does that, rather than me needing to go and unnecessarily click an accept button to get rid of it. I wish all websites would work like this, but that's just my view. We're getting there, but what about if we think about this problem? So let me just come and start my server API up, and while that's running, let's clear out and come back to a fresh state again. So imagine that the first time you're hitting our site, you come to the contact us page. So maybe you've gone to Google or some search engine or something like that, and there's a link on there that says if you want to contact us, you can come straight to /contact us. But this is the first time you've ever visited our site. So if I refresh that, we come to contact us, and you've got the cookie dialog there saying that you need to accept the cookies. Now, what if I don't accept the cookies, and I come over here and I just start using stuff and do that and send that in? That's all worked. And if I come over to the network tab and I go on authenticate, we can see that it's sending an auth cookie even though we haven't consented here, which again isn't obviously great. It's a necessary cookie, granted, but we haven't cookie consented yet. So what we need to do is auto consent if they hit the send button here, essentially, to automatically sign up to the use of those essential cookies before we allow them to actually send that in. So a little bit more fix up required to our site to make this happen. All these are edge cases that are unique to your site, and you obviously need to understand how your site works and where it uses cookies, and you need to go through and address all of these edge cases for how users can reach your site before they hit the cookie consent button. So let's go and fix up this particular case. Inside of our plugins, we've got our Axios call that's calling for the authenticate method for us on our behalf whenever there's an Axios call. So what we need to actually do is put some code in here to only allow this if we've consented. So we pop that in there just to check that we've got consent before we actually go and make that authentication call. So again, let's just prove that point, and I need to get rid of that cookie that I can't actually see. So I'm going to do a fresh browser for that. Let's come straight into the contact us page, and now if I try and send this in, we actually get a fail, which, although the dialog's in the way, let's just do that again, you do actually get the error down here. So you can see that that's not now actually allowing us to send that in because we haven't accepted the cookies. So how can we auto accept the cookies when we send this so that they don't have to go and accept this? So let's come over to our contact us page. In pages, contact us. Inside the submit form, we can just check the consent, and if it's not already accepted, we can just go and accept that consent. So again, we're using our Vuex store here to check the global consent, and if it hasn't already been consented to, we go and accept consent at this point. So now I can come in here and request to send an email that accepts consent, and I get a success without any further cookie consent acceptance, which again is a much better experience for the end user of our website. That's pretty much it. I think we got there in the end. It's a bit of a marathon chore to implement these cookie consent banners and ideas, and making sure that it's consistent and works functionally across your website. But we've got an auto dismissing cookie consent for all elements of our site, and equally, if we've got other areas of our site that need the cookie consent auto dismissing, we've shown here on the contact us page that we can implement that with only a few lines of code. So really good, simple stuff once you've got all that hard work of putting all the Vuex store in place. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed that, and if you found it useful, then please do drop me a comment or hit me a like, because it does help out the channel. And on that note, I will see you in the next video.